Hello and welcome back to Bookish. I'm here with kind of a surprise book review, book recommendation, and that is for this book, Tell Me How It Ends, an Essay in 40 Questions by Valeria Luiselli. You may recognize her name. She is the author of the much praised, and I believe, either last year or this year, Booker-nominated novel, The Lost Children Archive. This is an essay that she wrote based on her experience working with the Legal Aid Society that was trying to provide legal help to unaccompanied immigrant children beginning in 2015. And this essay also details her and her husband and her children's trip to Arizona in the midst of this unaccompanied minor refugee crisis, which began happening in 2014 and 2015, and which we see continuing in the United States, only now with families coming here seeking asylum instead. So this review recommendation is really just brought to you by serendipity. This is one of my son's books for the anthropology class that he'll be taking this fall. I ordered it online without paying attention to the author or anything about it, and it came in yesterday, and I just set the book on the table, on the kitchen table where we eat. Usually when I sit down and eat my cereal before I go to work in the morning, I sit and eat my cereal and I read something. I can't really sit there and eat breakfast without reading something, and I'll read anything. Normally what I read is Twitter. This is when I, get my morning outrage at the various assholeries of Donald Trump every morning, and I might engage in a little cathartic rage tweeting. But this morning my phone's battery was almost run all the way down, so I had to put it on the charger. And so I sat down without anything to read, and I picked up the first book next to me, and it was this book. And I began reading it during breakfast, and by the time breakfast was over, I was on page 35. The whole book's only 106 pages long, not counting acknowledgments and the notes section. So I took it to work with me, and I read between classes, and I read on my conference period, and I finished it today. And I wanted to come and make a video encouraging you to look for this essay, to look for this book. It's published by Coffee House Press, by the way, because I don't think, well, what I think is that anybody who is interested in the refugee crisis along the United States border, who is outraged at the behavior of the Trump administration in the United States in the face of this huge humanitarian crisis at the United States-Mexico border, and then anyone who's just interested in refugee crises that are taking place across Europe and in other places, this is a good book to kind of open your eyes to what is exactly going on. So Miss Luiselli and her husband took a trip to Arizona in 2014, right in the midst of this refugee crisis, which began with hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minors coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, seeking to cross the border and be granted asylum in the United States. This happened during the Obama administration, and this led to the opening of these ICE detention facilities, which the refugees refer to as ICE houses, number one, because of who runs them, and second, because they are notoriously cold. Miss Luiselli became aware of this refugee crisis while she was taking this trip with her husband and her family. When she returned to New York, which is where she lives, even though she is a citizen of Mexico and lived in South Africa for a while, when she returns to New York, she volunteers with I'm just going to refer to it as a legal aid organization, which was working to try to get these refugee kids lawyers before their deportation hearing came up. And so what she did, and what she details in the book, and what the 40 questions refer to, is that she acted as an interpreter for the kids, and she filled out this questionnaire which contained 40 questions. The answers to those 40 questions the kids gave would have a really big impact on whether or not they were allowed to stay in the United States, whether or not they were granted amnesty, whether or not they were granted what's called a U visa, which is a visa they could get if they could prove that returning or being deported home would be a risk to their health. There's a T visa, which they can get if they can prove that they've been the victim of human trafficking. And so she interprets for these kids who speak Spanish, and then she fills in the form in English. And what they hope is, what this organization hopes is, that they can attract lawyers who will take the cases for these kids who have the best chance at getting to stay. So obviously in this job she hears some harrowing stories and learns a lot about how this refugee crisis involving children began. These kids primarily come from 3 countries, and one of those countries is not Mexico. Those 3 countries are El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And these kids who come are either being sent or fleeing or their families trying to pay for them to get here because of the threat of gang violence and government corruption and just the horrible conditions in which they're growing up that are literal threats to their lives. That in El Salvador, young men are recruited forcibly to join MS-13 or Barrio 18, that these kind of gangs that are involved in drug trafficking are ruthless and brutal and kill, and that's why these kids are coming. And so even today, you know, with the family separation policy that Trump put in place, which is as cruel as you can imagine, even today, now that families are coming, they're primarily coming from those 3 countries in an attempt to save themselves and to save their kids by being granted some kind of resident status in the United States. Also, one of the things I didn't realize is that MS-13 started off as, and the Barrio 18, the other gang, started off as gangs in Los Angeles, and it was only when the Reagan administration deported tens of thousands of these gang members from Los Angeles back to their home countries in places like Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador that MS-13 spread to those places and became more heavily involved in drug trafficking, and that actually caused the growth of those organizations. That it was our policy that caused that growth to take place, and in the process it's U.S. policy which has decimated the lives of lots of people, along with their own government's policies, which has decimated the lives of lots of people in those countries. So a lot of things I didn't know. You know, I'd heard about coyotes. These are people who families hire to shepherd their kids across the U.S. border, and in the case of kids from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, they're having to travel essentially the length of Mexico. That a lot of them travel by train on a train they call La Bestia, or the Beast, which is, you know, an incredibly dangerous journey where they have to sleep and stay on top of the train cars, where violence, murder, accidents, rapes, all kinds of things take place. That when they reach the U.S. border, then they attempt to cross the border and they attempt to find Border Patrol agents to apprehend them. Important to note that these people are amnesty seekers. They are refugees fleeing from crime, human trafficking, a virtual war zone, and they are seeking amnesty. They're not trying to hide from U.S. government officials. They want to be found so they can get into the system, so they can go to these detention centers and then have a day in court, a deportation hearing, at which they might be granted amnesty or some other version of legal residence here in the United States. These are not people trying to sneak in and to fit into U.S. society and take jobs sneakily. These are people who are trying to come here and work their way through the system. Yes, they crossed the border illegally, but these kids that she talks about immediately and hopefully and felt lucky when Border Patrol agents picked them up. And I'd like to be able to tell you that it's just the Trump administration who bears responsibility for the incredible inhumanity that we've been showing to these refugees, kids, adults, families, etc. at the border for some time, but it's not. That inhumanity began with more restrictive immigration policies of the Reagan administration, deportations. It continued on a very cruel vein during the administration of George W. Bush. In fact, Bush put in place a policy which helps explain why almost none of the refugees in these camps are from Mexico, particularly refugee kids. According to a Bush policy passed in 2008, Border Patrol agents can just immediately deport unaccompanied Mexican kids back to Mexico. They don't have to give them a court hearing, a court date. They can literally pick them up, question them themselves, and on their own decision-making return them back to Mexico, and something like 99% are immediately deported. It's called voluntary deportation, which is just the most ridiculous thing ever. Obama also bears some blame for the awfulness of the situation we see going on, because he created essentially a fast-track document to create deportation hearings for these unaccompanied minors, with the goal of kind of dealing with the problem as fast as possible, which means not particularly dealing with it in a humanitarian way. before Obama's policy, which I think he put in place, I want to say in 2014 or 2015, unaccompanied minor refugee kids in the United States got about a year in which they could stay in the United States, look for legal help, try to find a lawyer, try to find sponsors, and the Obama policy cut that time from a year to 21 days. It's that 21-day fast track docket for kids on who are unaccompanied, who came to the United States across the Texas-Mexico border, that led to Valeria Luiselli volunteering her time to work at this legal aid society. It is shameful to me that the United States is in a position of treating refugee children this way, whether it's Bush, Obama, and now particularly under Trump. At the very least, we can say that Obama's policies were not intended to be cruel, even if they are officiously heartless, but the policies of President Trump are cruel, and as many people have said, the cruelty is the point. He thinks, or he wants his followers to believe, that if he makes the experience of coming here and seeking asylum unpleasant, that these people will go back home, that the crisis will go away, because we're going to make it so awful to try to come here that you'd rather stay home. God help us if we make it that horrible. I'll also point out that President Trump is violating U.S. and international law. These people are asylum seekers. They're refugees. They are not illegal immigrants. They are not illegal aliens. They're not undocumented immigrants. They are not undocumented aliens. They are asylum seekers. And according to our laws, they have the right to come here and seek asylum. They have that right, and they are being denied under President Trump's policies. And on top of that, incredibly cruel policy of separating families from kids is intended just to make the experience nightmarish so fewer people will come. It is shameful, and this book will make you, as an American, well aware of the awfulness of our policy and its human impact. Ms. Luiselli makes the point that what's happening in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras is not a problem just of those countries. It is a problem of all of our making. U.S. policy empowered those governments. U.S. policy deported gang members back to those countries. U.S. policy is what's preventing people from coming here and seeking asylum. The pressure we put on Mexico means that Mexico's attempted to stop these asylum seekers from coming, all of which results in human tragedy and cruelty on a grand scale. And that we as Americans, at the very least, have an obligation, if we are people of conscience, people who call themselves Christians, people who call themselves, believe they have charitable good hearts, we have a responsibility to vote for people who are going to seek real solutions, hemispheric solutions to this problem, and not treat refugees, people fleeing nightmarish situations, not to treat them like criminals, not to make their experience worse. Anyway, I strongly recommend reading Tell Me How It Ends by Valeria Luiselli, and this makes me want to read the Lost Children Archive, or novel, as well. I hope if you run across a copy, you'll read it. It's only about 106 pages long. I read it in a day, and I'm a slow reader. I will leave a link to Races Texas, which is an organization seeking to help these children and families who've been separated and who are in these detention camps along the border. I'll leave a link to their site below. I've done that before. I've donated money to that organization. I think they're doing good work to try to reverse some of the damage being done by U.S. policies along the border. Anyway, hope you read the book. Love to hear from you in the comment section. As always, thank you for watching.